Well, I can begin by welcoming everybody and saying thank you very much for coming. And it's great to see so many of you here. We've had these conversations over lockdown that, you know, more people are able to join us than ever before. So that's fantastic. But it is my big pleasure welcome Howard Wilson, who is my coordinator colleague in the Learning Network down in the Southwest and Bristol. Howard in the network has become, over this last few months, renowned for his fantastic ability to produce little videos at the drop of a hat explaining how to do Zoom and a great number of things. But he's also been very busy looking at the whole area of copyright and that kind of thing, which is what we've invited him to come and share with us today. So we're really grateful to have you with us, Howard. And he's even going to do some devotions for us, which I've seen before, which are fantastic, from one of his colleagues. So we're really grateful to have you with us, Howard, and I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back in Yorkshire. I grew up in Sheffield, so it's home very much so. And it was nice earlier to hear someone mention Bentley in Doncaster, because that's where we were immediately before Sheffield. So it's, yeah, back among friends, hopefully. As Rachel said, I've got a short video to share with you. This was created on the back of a piece that one of my team wrote for the Children and Families team about the way that they and their family have been worshipping together during lockdown. Bridget will be known to a few of you. She farms on the edge of Dartmoor. So I do tend to tease her terribly and call her Lady Bridget with the country estate. But it's a 200-acre farm. And this is their way that they as a family have got together. And one of the children prepared this, and I then turned it into a short video. A slightly different take on Zacchaeus, you may say. But I love the way that the children bring fresh thinking into things, and Bridget has such a wonderful way of looking at things, and her kids give us great joy. I can't wait till we can go back down to the farm and spend time with them again, because it's such a lovely time to be there. Oops. Computers are getting minds of their own this morning. Anyway, we're going to share some slides, because it just makes it easier to talk through this. Thinking a little bit about the topic of music and copyright online in particular, but copyright generally. This is one of those interesting areas. I'm going to suggest that you'll see this is obviously something we've done already in the Southwest, so it is good. It's a green presentation because we're recycling our material for you. If you've got any questions, do pop them up in the chat window, because it's really helpful for me to be able to check and to see that we're meeting the requirements that you have. I think it's important to say there is absolutely no such thing as a silly question in this instance. Now, if you're anything like me, I take when someone says there's no such thing as a silly question, I take that as a personal challenge, because I can always come up with a silly question. But it's interesting that there are always things to be learned in that. And if you've got knowledge and experience, share that with us as well, because we're all learning together. This is quite a complicated area. So much so, I would describe the law on copyright as a real minefield. It's complicated. There's a colossal amount to take on board, and it's certainly somewhere that you could say angels would fear to tread. There's a story told of God wandering around in heaven, checking that the wall between heaven and hell is in appropriately good condition. And God comes to a certain point and finds that there's a hole in the wall. And he thought, that shouldn't be there. So he calls Satan and he says, Satan, I need to talk to you about our adjoining wall. I think you've knocked a hole in it. And the devil says, yes, so what? What are you going to do about it? And God says, if you don't fix this hole, I will sue you. And the devil replied, yes, and where are you going to find a lawyer? Okay, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but it's a bit, this is a legal minefield and we need to be careful. We're all going to be coming with different levels of prior experience and knowledge. So hopefully we can share that. As I say, use the chat facility, which for some reason I can't see at the moment, but we'll come back to it. In terms of copyright licensing for churches, there's tons of information on the Methodist Church website. You may well have seen it. It does feel a little bit like an impenetrable forest. So what I've tried to do is simplify it. Looking at this, basically, if you want to use a written liturgy, then you need license from the publisher. Now, when we use our Methodist worship books, the license is implicit in the fact that we have the books. They're produced for that purpose. We can use them within Methodist worship. If somebody wanted to use a passage from a Methodist worship book in a different context, they would need permission from the publisher to do so. Similarly, if we want to listen to recorded music, the law says you have to have a phonographic performance license, PPL. Public worship is exempt. So we can play music in our church worship without any problems. But as soon as we go online, that isn't classed legally as public worship. And so we get into difficulties potentially. So we'll come back to that one. If we're performing a song to an audience, we're then in another area of law because that's performing rights. And this is where you see the PRS license talked about. And again, public worship is exempt. It's amazing how many things we're exempt if it's a worship context. I used to run the YMCA in Weston-super-Mare, and we wanted to do a young people's worship event. And I got the fire officer in because I wanted to know what capacity he would license me to use my sports hall, which only had 2 exits. So it was a bit dodgy. And he said, oh, he says, to be honest, looking at this sports hall, I wouldn't allow more than 5 people in here at a time, which rather spoils any basketball or football you might want to play in there. I said, oh dear, we were hoping to do a worship service in here. I mean, oh, worship? He says, fire regs don't apply to worship. You can do what you like. Rather worrying in some respects, but I suppose it's a question of faith, maybe. So, but if we're going to perform, again, the online space, perversely, isn't classed as public worship. So we need a PRS license. If we're making copies of lyrics or musical notation, so you know where we photocopy the music book for the choir, you have to have a print rights license for that. If we're making copies of an audio recording, we have to have a mechanical rights license. So you can see how we're starting to get into the minefield already. And if we're going to then use the song in a video, as we do more and more, you get into the synchronization rights, the synchronize, and you start thinking, I've almost already lost the will to do anything. But in the churches, we have a solution, thank goodness. For starters, with a lot of written liturgy, during all this situation with COVID, an awful lot of publishers have given exemptions. So they're happy to allow their materials to be used. Children's publishers who've said, yeah, we'll allow our materials to be used for during this time. You can do this. However, that in a lot of cases, that doesn't cover use for streaming online. So we need to be careful. Easiest way to check that out is to go to the publisher's own website. and they will have spelled out on there what they are willing to permit or not permit. We've then got our two licensing bodies that really help us out with this. There's the CCLI, who are extremely helpful and cover an awful lot of what we require, and that's Christian Copyright Licensing International. Their website is available at uk.ccli.com, and if you go to that website, you can check out an awful lot of what you need from them. Now, they will provide the PRS church license. So if you've got music groups in your church who are doing dance, doing youth groups, any of that sort of thing, and you want to be able to play recorded music in your building, you need to have the PRS church license, and that will cover you both for the phonographic performance license and for the performing rights license. So it makes it nice and easy, single payment to a single organization, you're covered. If you want to photocopy music to use with the choir, your copyright and reproduction licenses can be covered, and that can include your audio recordings are covered. Now, you'll notice that one license don't have a PRS license included. They do have a reprint license for congregational use. One of the problems we have, one license is what used to be called Calamus. And the difficulty we have is that not every Christian publisher, every songwriter is covered by the CCLI. So, for example, if you're using Graham Kendrick's music, to choose someone who's reasonably, Graham Kendrick's music is predominantly licensed through one license. It does amuse me they call themselves one license, because of course they aren't the only license you need, because you do still need your CCLI. If you then want to stream things onto your internet connection, you need a streaming license, which again, CCLI can cover for you. And one license can do you a podcast and a streaming license as well. So that covers you for getting online. And you'd think that's lovely and simple. Well, that only covers us if we're using our own websites. Of course, most of us want to use YouTube, Facebook, or maybe Zoom. And things then start to get a little bit more complicated again. With YouTube and Facebook, if you want to use written liturgy, you will need direct consent from the publisher, because you're not covered by any worship thing, because YouTube and Zoom are not seen as being public worship. Now, most translations of the Bible will still allow us to do that. Interestingly, when I put this presentation together originally, the New Revised Standard Version was one version that didn't permit this. But I noticed recently on their website, they've changed their license terms, and they do now permit reasonable use online, as long as it's properly cited that it's from them. As an example of one you need to be extremely careful with, many of you will know the Footprints poem, that wonderful story of the person walking on the beach and they see two lots of footprints behind them, and it says, "Lord, why is it at the difficult times in my life I see only one set of footprints?" And he says, "Well, those were the times I carried you." You'll notice I've summarized it, not quoted it. They are about the most litigious publisher there is. For goodness sake, don't ever print their thing in your notices or anything, and certainly don't use it online. They employ a whole branch of people just tracking instances of breaches of their copyright. So that's the one extreme. At another extreme, a lot of people, well, it's a bit of good publicity, we'll let it go. But if you're being technically correct, you do need individual direct consent for quoting published authors. YouTube and Facebook have got their own deal with the Performing Rights Society. So actually, you don't need to worry about playing music on their sites, provided you've got the right to play that music. So you don't need the performing rights license, but you do still need to be conscious of the fact that the copyright of that music is owned elsewhere. So we need to be a little bit cautious there. For all the other bits, CCLI and one license will cover us to do things on YouTube and Facebook. But it's wise, if you're going to put a recording up, and certainly if you're going to live stream, let them know in advance that you're using copyright material under license. My local circuit decided that they would put a live worship session up online, and everything was ready, and it got to 3 o'clock and they hit transmit, and at 3:05 YouTube hit stop and said, no, you can't do this. And it took them about an hour to persuade YouTube that the CCLI license would cover them. Had they contacted YouTube in advance and said, this is what we're going to be doing, here's our license, it would have been allowed to go through, no problem. So it's one to be aware of there. They've got very good filters on these things that can pick up breaches of copyright. Zoom is a slightly peculiar thing, because Zoom, of course, isn't designed for this sort of thing at all. It's really for these sorts of business type meetings. So you will need all your licenses plus a limited online music license, which you can only get direct from the Performing Rights Society. That's because YouTube and Facebook are already licensed for transmission of music. Zoom isn't a music network, and so therefore doesn't have that facility on it. So we need to be licensed. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that Zoom is largely a private meeting. So one could argue you're highly unlikely to get caught. But obviously I can't advocate that approach. Then the other thing to be aware of in terms of copyright and licensing, everything that we put online will have some form of copyright attached to it. Our Bibles are copyright of the organizations that have translated them. As I've indicated earlier, most Bible publishers will allow limited use. So you can quote, I think they usually say up to about a quarter of a book, or up to so many 500 verses, or you can do this. There are limits, and most that will cover us for most of our purposes. So that's fine. Images are problematic. You can't just look up a photograph on Google and then use it online, because it's the copyright of that image is held by the person who created it. A minister in Cornwall pointed out to me, this can even go as far as images we create ourselves. In their particular community, there's a war memorial that is itself copyrighted, and you can't actually walk up to, photograph it, and then use that photograph. Now, as I pointed out to him, I said, that's fine. You as a local know that. If I was visiting, saw it, photographed it, and then went back to my home church, how on earth am I supposed to know that? But certainly within their local community, it's known that you may not do that. Memes that you see online, there's some lovely ones around, these pictures that people have put witty comments on everything. The problem is they're an absolute minefield, because you don't know who owns the copyright to the image, potentially who owns the copyright to the words that have been used. So the best thing with those is steer clear, don't reproduce them. If you see one that's really, really funny, just describe it and talk it through with people. And obviously films. Now, your CCLI license can cover you for use of lots of films. And if you've got the right license within CCLI, They even have a website where you can download sections of films to use in services and the like. But if you've just been down the, show my age now, if you've just been down the DVD shop, bought a wonderful DVD, we're not allowed to just edit it and use that. The interesting thing as well with a lot of this, what we're permitted to do within our worship services, within the four walls of our own building, is different to what we can do in the wider world of being online. You know, there's an awful lot we're permitted to do within what's deemed to be a private act of worship compared to YouTube, Facebook, and Zoom, which are said to be public spaces. And so we do need to be very, very cautious. Now, the danger here is this is a bit of a rushed view through, but what's useful, I think, is to try and have a chat about examples and about what your experiences have been and any questions that people have. Does repeating a newspaper headline require permission from the newspaper? I think if you're just repeating the headline and commenting on the story, then you're absolutely fine. If you want to reprint the article in your newsletter, then it would be courteous to drop them a line and just sort of say, this is what we hope to do. We've had an interesting situation, actually. We had in Plymouth, they have a digital, let me get this right, a digital performing arts worker in the circuit. And they have been desperately wanting to prepare something for Remembrance Sunday. And they'd written a poem and things to go, and for it to sit over the music, You Raise Me Up. Now, we've had some tremendous fun trying to work out how to legally do this. Were they to do it in their church, they could easily use a karaoke recording, get someone to sing it, project what they like, and do absolutely pretty much anything they like, and they'd be covered by all the normal licensing because it's in a church worship service. They wanted to produce it as a video resource for use online. CCLI declined to cover it because it's a circuit resource, not a church resource. So we couldn't get around it that way. In the end, what they've done is they've contacted Universal, who own the copyright to the song. And they've spent an awful lot of time badgering Universal. They've been unable to get a reply from them, but it does give them a good defense that they have made every reasonable effort to gain permission. In order to avoid being done for using a copyrighted version, they've got a local musician to record the whole thing for them as a cover version using their studio. If I say now, they have a major advantage here in that their local musician who's helped them out is Paul Field, who will be known to a lot of Methodists and has written for Cliff Richard and published and all sorts of things. And obviously Paul has a lot of experience on that side of things, but it's been a real minefield to get it together. In terms of contacting YouTube and Facebook in advance, on your studio creator section of the website, there is a way to contact support, and you just have to get in touch with support and get them through. I did find it. I didn't make a note of where it was, but I will look it up and let you have that back. But it's buried in there. But it's well worth the effort because all they do then, they can just put a little tag on it and stop it getting caught. You can also get caught out. I mean, you watched that little video I used for the devotions. The music for that comes with the software package that created the animation, and is fully licensed and what have you. If you've got a license for the software, you're fully licensed to unrestricted use of the music. Despite that, I did have a copyright claim against me on not that particular one, but one of our other videos on YouTube. And it was simply a matter of going back to YouTube, giving them the details of the software publisher and saying, look, this is fully legal, fully licensed. And YouTube backed down and said, oh yeah, it's obviously someone trying it on, but this is not the case. But it does show why it's useful to have access to that utterly license-free music. And I'll come back to that on images in a moment. A lot of publishers during the period of COVID have relaxed their strictness, but yes, it's worth checking the individual their individual websites to be clear. As the author has given permission, he owns the copyright usually, not the publisher. So if your individual author gives you permission, you're okay there. And we do need to acknowledge any copyrights that we use. Anyone who's giving permission will normally say, this is how we expect it to be cited. So, a quick short quote from the Bible, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. We can just put John 3:16, NRSV, and you're fine. If I've quoted, say, the whole of John's chapter, let's say we did John chapter 1, the prologue, that would probably want a fuller quotation. And if you look on our YouTube channel, we've got Bible verses that we've prepared for use in services, and at the end of those it actually writes out the full NRSV copyright disclaimer that is required. It's John 1:1-18, NRSV from the New Revised Standard Version, copyright 1989 of the United Churches of America, blah 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 blah. And you just have that written down somewhere where it's clear. As long as you've got you can show you've got license, YouTube and Facebook will permit you to put up stuff that is copyright, but you have to be able to show that you have a license permitting you to do so. And this is where the CCLI licenses can come in handy. It does help if you get someone from the UK on the YouTube thing, because sometimes the Americans haven't heard of CCLI. Yeah, YouTube will usually give warnings rather than remove content. I think their concern with the circuit event we had was because it was streaming live, it was difficult for them to be able to track what exactly was happening. YouTube videos can be fun generally. Is there a way of being able to allow it? Only really if you can get the originator of the video to give you permission to do it. The difficulty being YouTube terms and conditions specifically prohibit the downloading of any material from YouTube. And that's particularly awkward because, I would say, the video we used for devotions at the beginning of this, we own all the copyright on that video. I have absolutely no problem. If you want to use that in another setting, that's absolutely fine, and you can get it off our YouTube channel. But technically YouTube would say you're not allowed to download it. But it is difficult if it's a video that's been created, a worship video being created by somebody else. The fact that it's on YouTube, the easiest way is to get people to link to it for themselves. But of course, in an online service, that's difficult to do. And circuit services can be problematic because, of course, circuits can't hold CCLI licenses because they don't have a congregation from which to calculate the fees that are due. The usual way of getting around that is to use the CCLI license of the church that is hosting the meeting, or as we did for our synod last week. A church produced the worship for it, so we used their CCLI license for the worship session. If copyright is always almost always resides with the author, So if the author gives permission, what you can find is that publishers sometimes hold the copyright for the typesetting. So if you make a straight photocopy, you might have this is where it gets great fun. You might have the author's permission to use the words, but not the publisher's permission to use the typesetting. So someone said there, if it's typed out, you're reasonably okay with that. Similar point, someone saying, recording nursery rhymes played on your own piano from memory and sung. Nursery rhymes generally are of such an age that they are outside of copyright. Copyright only exists for a certain length of time after the death of the author. And the classic example of that one would be following the death of J.J. Barrie. The story of Peter Pan is technically now in public domain and may be used any which way you like. There is, because J.M. Barrie donated all the proceeds from Peter Pan to Great Ormond Street Hospital, it's become a matter of honour that anybody using the story still voluntarily makes payment to the hospital. But it couldn't actually be enforced in a court of law. So that's an interesting example of where something's come out of copyright, but copyright is still being recognised. There's the comment, copyright lasts 75 years after their death. Interestingly, there's been arguments, and I know Cliff Richard has been involved in this, about phonographic recordings coming out of copyright. I have a feeling from memory it's 50 years after the date that they're launched, which is a little bit odd. But his argument, he doesn't need the money, he's fine with it. But as he says, there are artists who have worked on these things who are due royalties who don't get it because its longevity is carried on. But that is one of the difficulties. It is about checking individual items with their publisher via their websites. If in doubt, make it, like we've done with the You Raise Me Up, make every reasonable effort to make contact. The thing that tends to worry people is the fear of being sued. And generally, even the Methodist Church, big as it is, probably isn't worth the effort of suing over a minor copyright infringement. And usually the resolution will be either the publishing of an apology or taking down what's been put online. The difficulty we have is that for some people, the church is seen as big enough to be worth suing, and they would sue the Methodist Church corporate, not St. Mark's, Biddlesworth or whatever. So the fact that you're a tiny church with 10 pounds in the bank wouldn't necessarily stop someone, because they'd look at going for the parent body, if you like. The other bit I said I'd come back to is the use of images. As I say, for example, I'm using an image behind me. That is my own photograph taken when I'm out walking. Therefore, there's no breach of copyright, and that's absolutely fine. If I wanted to search online to find an image to illustrate a sermon or a piece of training that I'm doing, there are certain websites that have royalty-free materials available. So, for example, one that we've been using a lot recently has been unsplash.com. And unsplash.com, all of their material can be used freely, no problem. So if I've got a choice between publishing something from them and publishing something that I found randomly on Google, then I'm going to go to that way. Yeah, Pixabay is another one. There's one called churchmotiongraphics.com. But it's been kept. I tend to work on the assumption if it's been on the Methodist Church website, it's either is copyright free or we've already paid the copyright on it. But that's maybe me as a member of the connectional team thinking, well, it's our connectional website, I can use it. but I think that's probably generally safe. I have got a screen. I'll just share you this screen, but I'll send this to Rachel, so you've got the slides from this. That's just a few organisations that we've found have been useful in pulling information together. There is really good guidance on the Methodist Church's own website. It just isn't necessarily the easiest to read, but that sort of thing is available. But it is a great minefield, but I think it's important not to let it stop you doing stuff that you want to do. There is usually a way to do it. It's just a matter of stop, think, how can we find a sensible, legitimate way around this? Matt's just said, freebibleimages.org is good for images for Bible studies. And that's brilliant. You see, if we can find and share these sources, it does make life a lot easier for us all. If you want to get into doing the sort of animation that you saw in the devotions, that's done via a piece of software called Doodly, Doodly. If you just Google that. But you can actually get, I think it was something like £40, so it's not break the bank expensive. But for a further £20, you can get a full set of what they call Doodly for Churches images. It's interesting, it's American software, but the Doodly for Churches images come from Australia. But they're all the right way up, so you don't have to turn them upside down. But they're lovely just to find different ways of being able to tell our stories. Thank you, Catherine. That's doodly.com. But let's get out there. Yeah, we're in a new world. We need to start using these ways of doing things and go for it with a confidence. It's like, if you've asked permission, you're generally going to be okay. There are a number of videos on our YouTube channel. One which I would definitely publicize is the online worship discussion, which was a connectional wide discussion about how we do online worship and how it's been developing and what ideas have been tried. That's a really good, interesting one. It's only about 50 minutes. But there are examples of Bible reading videos. There's different ways of thinking. There's another one by Bridget and the children working with the author Theodora Whittington, who's a children's author.
Howard's put his email address in the chat, so if anybody wants to contact Howard, then I'm very grateful that he said he'll.
I may live to regret this.
Yeah, you might. No, I'm sure you won't.
It'll be fine.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much, Howard. That's been so helpful. We're really grateful to you, and we'll see everybody back here at 1 o'clock for dispersal again. Thank you.